50 wealthy customers in designer linen were screaming their heads off. One private boat ramp was chained shut with heavy-duty industrial steel, and 20 local news cameras were capturing every second of the absolute meltdown. "You're destroying my business, you bitter old man." Vivian Blackstone was shrieking, her voice hitting a pitch that probably had every dog in the county howling, as her upscale diners realized their $400 sunset reservations were officially trapped on the wrong side of my locked gate. The air was thick with the stink of expensive perfume and idling diesel engines, a perfect, chaotic mess that had been brewing since the day a Seattle millionaire decided my family's legacy was her personal piggy bank. But let me back up, because this isn't just about a locked gate. It's about what happens when greed tries to pave over 70 years of Montana soul. My name is Garrett Holloway, 58 years old, a retired Boeing engineer who spent my life building things that stay in the air, and I honestly thought my biggest retirement stress would be whether the trout were biting or if I had enough night crawlers in the cooler. My grandfather bought this 40-acre slice of heaven back in 1952, 300 feet of pristine lakefront, where 4 generations of my family learned to cast a line and hold their breath. I can still smell the pine-scented mist rolling off that water at dawn, the exact same way it did when I was 8 years old, watching Grandpa pull a trout from the Mirror Still Lake while the coffee steam curled around his weathered face. He was a smart man, my grandpa. He knew the world would get crowded and greedy. So when he built the only boat ramp for 8 miles in either direction, he made sure the 1952 deed granted lake access in perpetuity for every local resident. He wanted to make sure working families could always fish where their fathers taught them. Then there was Sarah, my late wife, the woman who turned this dirt and water into a sanctuary. For 20 years, she hosted the Memorial Base Derby, a tradition that started with 15 local families and grew into the heartbeat of our community. After she passed 3 years ago, I kept it going as a tribute, a way to keep her memory alive in every splash of a kid's first catch and every whoop of joy from the dock. I was even planning to open Sarah's bait and tackle in the old marina shed, just a humble place for gear and stories. But that was before Vivian Blackstone arrived like a designer-dressed hurricane. Vivian had been here 18 months, a Seattle transplant who moved in after her husband's investment firm relocated, and everything about her screamed desperate, insecure wealth. The leased Tesla, the outfits that looked like they belonged on a runway instead of a mountain trail, and that fake, brittle confidence that usually masks a maxed-out credit card. She didn't just join the HOA. She seized it, running for president on a platform of modernization, which we quickly realized was just code for making everything too expensive for the people who actually live here. Her first move? Banning fishing from any HOA shoreline because it was aesthetically incompatible with her vision, and her second was complaining about undesirable elements using the waterfront, by which she meant anyone who didn't look like they stepped out of a luxury travel catalog. The real war started in March. In our little community center that usually smells like floor wax and potluck coffee, when Vivian projected images of floating restaurants from the East Coast onto a bedsheet. "We're going to build a premier dining destination, Blackstone's Floating Bistro," she declared, her voice dripping with that specific kind of condescension you only get from people who think money equals intelligence. She talked about $45 entrees and $15 launch fees, promising sophistication and economic vitality to a lake that was already perfectly vital without her. And when I stood up to remind her that the only boat ramp was on my private property, she just gave me that practiced, pitying smile. "Progress requires tough decisions, Garrett," she said, cutting me off before I could finish. "And we have the legal authority to enhance lake amenities for the betterment of all residents." I saw it in her eyes right then. She didn't care about the deed. She didn't care about the history, and she certainly didn't care about the 10-year-old kid I'd seen in tears a week later because his dad couldn't afford her new $25 launch fee. Construction started at 5 a.m. on a Monday, a massive semi-truck rumbling down our quiet lake road, carrying sections of what looked like a small aircraft carrier. The diesel fumes hit me first, choking out 70 years of clean mountain air, followed by the whine of hydraulic cranes and the sharp, rhythmic crack of nail guns echoing across water that used to carry nothing but the call of loons. By Wednesday, the crystal-clear water where my grandkids learned to swim was clouded with muddy runoff, and when I called the county to complain about the noise and the permits, a clerk told me Vivian had all necessary exemptions. She'd fast-tracked the whole thing, cutting corners like a person who was running out of time, positioning her floating monstrosity right in the center of the view from my dock, right where Sarah used to sit with her morning coffee. Vivian even had the gall to stab yellow plastic, no fishing, private zone markers into the lake bed in a 100-yard radius around her construction site, claiming water that had been open to everyone since the glaciers melted. She thought she was untouchable, protected by her Seattle lawyers and her new political friends in the county seat. But Vivian made one massive mistake. She underestimated a retired engineer with a lot of time on his hands and a very deep sense of spite. I spent 3 days in the dusty basement of the county courthouse, digging through environmental impact studies and permit databases until my eyes blurred, and that's when I found the first crack in her foundation. She'd skipped the mandatory state commercial waterway permits, thinking a local building permit was enough to dump grease and sewage into our drinking water. I made a quiet call to the state's anonymous tip line, and when the inspector showed up on Thursday morning, a very thorough lady who didn't care about designer heels, she shut the whole operation down on the spot. The silence that followed when the machines stopped was the most beautiful music I'd heard in months. Vivian came storming over to my porch that afternoon, her face red enough to stop traffic, waving a cease and desist order like a sword. "I know you're behind this, you bitter old man," she screamed, her perfectly manicured hands shaking with rage. I just took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and smiled. Just concerned about the water quality, Vivian wouldn't want anything to happen to our beautiful lake. She told me I had no idea who I was messing with, that the project was happening whether I liked it or not. And then she peeled out in her Tesla, spraying gravel like bullets, but I wasn't worried. I'd seen the fear behind the fury, and I knew that if I kept digging, I'd find the rot that was driving her desperation. The local fishermen started stopping by, bringing me sandwiches and quiet thank yous, and even some HOA members like Betty Sterling were starting to ask why Vivian hadn't shared the financial plans, but Vivian wasn't done. She hired armed private security guards to stand around the site in tactical vests. And then she went nuclear, filing a harassment complaint against me and calling an emergency meeting to fine me $500 for obstructing community improvements. She even claimed my boat ramp belonged to the HOA through adverse possession, a legal term she'd clearly Googled but didn't understand. But as I grabbed my metal detector at dawn to find Grandpa's original iron survey stakes, I found something that made my blood boil: fresh footprints around the markers. She wasn't just trying to use my land anymore. She was trying to steal the dirt itself. The morning dew was soaking through my old work boots as I crouched over that third survey stake, the one right by the ramp, and my heart hammered in my chest as I stared at those fresh footprints in the dark, disturbed earth. Expensive hiking boots, probably worn by some high-priced surveyor she'd hired to find a loophole in my grandfather's 1952 boundaries. Vivian Blackstone wasn't just a bully with a checkbook. She was a colonizer trying to rewrite the map of my life while I was still standing on it. But 40 years at Boeing had taught me one thing: blueprints don't lie, and neither does the dirt. I called on my own pro, a local guy named Jose Martinez, who's been surveying this valley since the mountains were hills, and as his GPS equipment pinged with cold, mathematical certainty, he just shook his head. "Garrett, she's trying to claim the ramp is HOA property because they maintained it, but this stake is exactly where your grandpa drove it. It's 100% yours, and she knows it." But Vivian wasn't waiting for the law to catch up. She was busy coronating herself as the queen of the lake, launching a Madison Avenue-style marketing blitz for Blackstone's Floating Bistro, complete with full-page ads showing couples in white linen sipping cocktails on what used to be a family fishing spot. She installed a high-tech electronic gate at the ramp entrance, my ramp entrance, with a shiny credit card reader and a digital display that flashed $25 for daily access. The soft beep-beep of the card reader replaced the natural silence of the lake, and the smell of fresh concrete mixed with the mounting smell of grease from her bistro's kitchen vents. It was the cruelty of it that finally broke my patience. I watched from my kitchen window on Saturday morning as Chuck Morrison's 12-year-old grandson, a kid who'd been cast fishing there since he could walk, was turned away by a security guard in a tactical vest because Chuck's credit card kept getting rejected by the system. The boy's face crumpled as he looked back at the water he'd been told was the community's lake, and the sound of his quiet questions to his grandpa carried across the water like a knife. Then there was Mrs. Petrosky, a 78-year-old widow who'd driven 40 minutes to scatter her husband's ashes from the dock, where they'd gotten engaged 60 years ago. Vivian's guard told her the fee was non-negotiable, even for a memorial. She was crying on the phone to me later that night, and that was the moment Garrett Holloway, the polite retired engineer, officially left the building. I spent that night under the glow of a single lamp, studying the original 1952 deed until my eyes burned, and that's when I noticed a phrase I'd always overlooked as a kid. Riparian rights extending 50 feet into the lake bed. My grandpa hadn't just bought the shoreline. He'd bought the ground under the water. I spent the next morning at the courthouse cross-referencing GPS coordinates with the original underwater survey, and I started to laugh, a real, deep-belly laugh that probably sounded a bit unhinged to the clerks. Vivian's entire floating restaurant wasn't just near my property. The massive anchors and half the floating platform were sitting directly on the lake bed that belonged to the Holloway family. She wasn't just using my ramp illegally, she was trespassing on my underwater dirt. While Vivian was celebrating her soft opening, with wine glasses clinking and artificial laughter echoing across Sarah's favorite star-watching spot, I was digging through her personal financial history, and what I found was a death warrant for her Seattle dreams. Vivian Blackstone wasn't a millionaire. She was a ghost. Her investment firm had collapsed 18 months ago. She was drowning in lawsuits, and her husband had been hit with tax liens that would make a billionaire blink. The Tesla? Leased. The designer clothes? Probably on a credit card she couldn't pay. She moved to Montana not for vitality, but to hide from her debts using a new identity as a small-town power player. But the real kicker, the thing that made my blood run cold, was the $400,000 commercial loan she'd just secured to finish the bistro. She'd used the HOA's common property, the community pool, the clubhouse where we held Sarah's memorial, the tennis courts, as collateral without a single member vote. She'd mortgaged every neighbor's future for a floating restaurant that was hemorrhaging money faster than a sinking boat. She needed $25,000 a month just to break even. And in a Montana winter, she was going to be bankrupt by December, and she was planning to take the whole neighborhood down with her. I didn't go to the sheriff, and I didn't go to the HOA board. Not yet. I wanted this to be elegantly simple, a solution with no moving parts that would dismantle her empire in one fell swoop. I drove to Billings and met with a guy named Jake Reeves, a former Marine who specialized in high-security access control, and I told him I needed a hydraulic steel-reinforced gate that couldn't be cut, rammed, or bypassed. I wanted a barrier that would make a tank reconsider. While Vivian's staff was training for the big Labor Day weekend, her last chance at a revenue surge, I was pouring steel-reinforced concrete bollards 4 feet deep in my own private soil. The community was starting to wake up too. I bought coffee for 15 local families at Chuck's shop and spread the loan documents out on the table. The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of fury. She bet our kids swim lessons on her bistro. Betty Sterling asked, her voice trembling, without even asking us. Chuck just shook his head, looking at the photos of his grandson being turned away, and I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for Sarah's legacy anymore. I was fighting for the soul of the lake. I told them the plan, the gate, the lawsuit, and the public exposure, and I saw the veterans and the fishermen nod in a slow, rhythmic agreement. The gate went live at exactly 5 p.m. on the Friday of Labor Day weekend, just as the first BMWs and Audis from the city were rolling in for Vivian's exclusive sunset dinner. I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the chaos erupt. A German-engineered SUV pulled up to the ramp and found a massive, hydraulic steel barrier blocking the way. And within 10 minutes, there was a line of 6 cars, drivers getting out to scream at the empty air while their $400 dinner reservations turned into a very expensive parking lot disaster. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later in her Tesla, slamming into park and storming toward the gate like she could melt the steel with her glare. "Garrett!" she screamed, her voice cracking as her Seattle sophistication completely evaporated. "You can't do this. I have a business. I have customers." I just leaned back in my chair and gave her a little wave. "Evening, Vivian. Nice gate, isn't it? Jake says it's rated for vehicle impact. Hope he didn't plan on moving any boats today." She started kicking the steel bollards with her designer heels, a pathetic display of desperation that the security cameras I'd installed caught in high definition. She was realizing, in real time, that her empire was built on quicksand, and I was the one who just pulled the plug. She tried to go nuclear after that. She called the cops. She tried to ram the gate with a boat trailer at 2 a.m., which resulted in a very expensive repair bill for her trailer and zero damage to my steel, and she even sent 2 social workers to my house for a wellness check, claiming I had dementia. But I invited them in, showed them my engineering files, my property surveys, and my meticulously organized evidence of her fraud. They left looking more worried about her than me. Then came the phone call from Betty Sterling that changed everything. Vivian's husband had found out about the HOA loan, and he was threatening immediate divorce and asset separation. The Queen of the Lake was officially out of time, and the Labor Day weekend was about to become the scene of her final public downfall. The Labor Day sun was beating down on the lake, but for Vivian Blackstone, it was the coldest day of her life. The grand opening she'd spent hundreds of thousands on was a ghost town, with her staff standing around in crisp white uniforms on a floating platform that nobody could reach. The only boat ramp for miles was a fortress of steel, and the news crews from Missoula and Billings were already setting up their tripods on the public road, smelling the blood of a wealthy transplant's spectacular failure. Vivian had tried one last legal Hail Mary, a frivolous lawsuit for malicious interference. But when we walked into Judge Morrison's courtroom on Tuesday morning, it was less of a hearing and more of an execution. The judge looked to the 1952 deed, the GPS surveys, and the photographs of the anchors trespassing on my lake bed, and he didn't even let her lawyer finish his opening statement. "Case dismissed," he said, his voice echoing like a gavel through the room. "Mr. Holloway is exercising his rights on land his family has owned since before your client was born. And Mrs. Blackstone, you might want to find a lawyer who understands property law better than you understand progress." With her legal shield shattered, the final blow came from the people she'd tried to buy, her restaurant staff, the servers, and the kitchen crew who'd been watching their paychecks bounce like rubber balls, walked out in a single coordinated move. I watched from my dock as the Blackstone hospitality flag was replaced by a handwritten sign taped to the bistro door. "You can't pay us with scenic views and empty promises." The regional food critic who'd arrived expecting culinary excellence ended up writing a scathing exposé not about the food, but about the fraudulent foundation of a Seattle socialite's Montana fantasy. The Thursday evening city council meeting was the largest in our town's history, a standing room-only crowd of 300 people who'd lived through 18 months of Vivian's tyranny. She arrived late, dressed in a power suit that looked like a suit of armor, but her hands were trembling so much she could barely hold her notes. She tried to seize the microphone, launched into a frantic speech about economic stagnation and NIMI selfishness, but the room was dead silent. People weren't intimidated anymore. They were just disgusted. When I walked to the front of the room and handed the mayor the folder containing the loan documents, the proof that she'd mortgaged the community pool and clubhouse for her personal greed, the murmur of the crowd turned into a roar of fury. Mrs. Blackstone didn't build a restaurant, I told the room, my voice carrying the weight of 70 years of Holloway history. She built a criminal enterprise using your property and your future. She bet your kids swim lessons on $45 stakes, and she did it while charging you to use the lake your grandfathers gave you. The handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists was the only sound that mattered. Detective Morrison, Chuck's own nephew, led her out of the community center as the news cameras flashed, catching the exact moment the Queen of the Lake became just another inmate in the county jail. The gate came down the next morning at dawn. I had Jake's crew remove the steel barriers and the card reader, and by noon, the ramp was open again, open the way Grandpa intended, with no fees, no security guards, and no designer filters. Chuck Morrison was the first one down the ramp, his grandson grinning in the passenger seat with his tackle box on his lap, and the look he gave me as he backed his boat into the water was better than any engineering award I'd ever won. The bistro was towed away by the bank's asset recovery team a week later, a hulking skeleton of greed disappearing around the far bend of the lake, leaving the water clear and the air smelling like pine once again. The HOA was dissolved by a unanimous vote later that month. We realized we didn't need professional management or modernization to be a neighborhood. We just needed to look out for each other. Betty Sterling became the head of our informal neighborhood council, and our first act was officially dedicating the shoreline as a conservation area in Sarah's name. We even opened Sarah's Bait and Tackle in the old marina, and every Saturday morning you can find Chuck, Betty, and me sitting on the dock, sharing coffee and stories while a new generation of kids learns how to cast. Vivian Blackstone is currently serving 18 months for embezzlement and fraud. Her husband divorced her before the first court date. And the Tesla, well, I hear it was repossessed from the courthouse parking lot. But here on the lake, the only thing that matters is the sound of the loons and the splash of a trout at sunset. Grandpa's deed is still in the safe, and Sarah's memory is in every ripple of the water. So, here's what I want to know from you. Was I right to shut that gate and trap those customers to save the neighborhood? Or was there a better way to handle a woman who'd bought half the county? We've all dealt with that person who thinks they can privatize the things we love. The HOA Karens, the developer Kens, the ones who think progress means their profit. Drop your worst story in the comments. Let's argue about property rights and community soul. And tell me, if it was your family's legacy on the line, how far would you go to protect the dirt your grandfather bled for? Hit subscribe to join the crew. Stay tuned for the next battle. And remember, before you build on someone else's foundation, you'd better make sure you know where the property line ends. The lake is open, the trout are biting, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like home. Would you like me to look into another case of HOA overreach, or perhaps a story about a different kind of property battle?